apples and bananas. I need to eat apples and bananas. Why can't I eat apples and bananas?
Support the Feeding America nationwide network of food banks to help provide meals to those in need. Join us at feedingamerica.org.
Due to the graphic nature of the following program, viewer discretion is advised.
Describe how this murder mystery began to unfold.
It began to unfold in September of 1934. The only problem was nobody knew that anything was unfolding at that time. They just thought it was a very strange, rather horrible murder. A man by the name of Frank Lagasse, who lived in Beulah Park, which is east of Bracknell and Euclid, was walking along the shores of Lake Erie looking for driftwood to burn. This was, after all, the Depression. And he saw something which he later described to friends as looking like a tree trunk with the bark stripped off of it. When he got closer, he realized it was the lower half of a woman's torso, amputated at the knees, but thighs still attached. He alerted the police immediately. One of the more interesting sidelights to his particular story is his wife was pregnant, and she was so panicked she went into labor that day. They didn't find very much of the rest of the body. They searched everywhere from downtown Cleveland to North Perry Township. The coroner at the time decided the woman had been dead for maybe 6 months, and that her body had been in the water perhaps 3 or 4. It's hard to tell. She was never identified. No one was ever arrested for murder, and she was simply called by the police the Lady of the Lake. And she was more or less forgotten. What we normally call the Kingsbury Run murders, torso murders, didn't begin officially until September of 1935. And it was, I think, a Monday. It was September 23rd, 1935. 2 young boys, 16 and 12, who lived in the Broadway 55th area, were running along the top of an elevation affectionately known as Jackass Hill. And they were tossing a softball back and forth. And one of the boys missed the ball and it rolled down the hill into the gully. So the older boy challenged the younger one to time-honored test of teenage manhood. I'll race you to the bottom to see who gets there first. Well, the 16-year-old got there first, and he stopped and he looked around and he froze. And he interrupted his 12-year-old friend by saying, "There's a dead man in the bushes with no head." When the police arrived, they found the body of a white male, naked except for his socks, decapitated and emasculated. The body was clean and drained of blood. Whoever had done this had obviously done it somewhere else and simply left the body here. As they explored the area, they found the body of another man, also decapitated, also emasculated. But this would have been there for quite some time, maybe as long as a month. But it was hidden in the sumac bushes, so no one would see it unless they were really on top of it. What amazes me is no one smelled it, but it's something else. They found the heads of both men buried in the dirt with just enough hair of one of them sticking above the surface to make sure the police would find them. The second man, who'd been dead for a month, was never identified. The first man was identified as 29-year-old Edward Andrassy, who lived on Fulton Avenue with his parents. And he was what police in those days called a snotty punk. He had been arrested any number of times for drinking and brawling. He was even known for sleeping off his drunks in cemeteries. As far as anyone could determine, the man had only held one even reasonably steady job in his life. Over a period of, if I remember correctly, 5 or 6 years, he'd been hired and fired 11 times at Old City Hospital, now Metro General, where he worked as an orderly in the psycho ward. Interesting, isn't it? He remains one of only 2 out of the official 12 victims that were ever identified. When I began researching Kingsbury Run, I went to the spot where his address was on Fulton, and it was a vacant lot then. In more recent years, it's one of those shishi-poo-poo condos. And I can't tell you how many times I've been tempted to go knock on the door and say, do you know who used to live here? That's when they started, but this was a year after the Lady of the Lake, and there was no connection between the crimes at that point.
Well, okay, but interesting. How did it eventually become known as the Kingsbury Run?
Because Edward Andrassy and victim number 2 were found in Kingsbury Run.
So where the kids ran down to?
Kingsbury Run is a prehistoric riverbed. It's attached to the flats, and it swings in a southeast arc, out to maybe East 79th or East 90th. It's bordered on the east end by the Woodland area, and on the south end by the Broadway 55th area, Slavic Village. Again, it's similar to Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper, there are 5 canonical victims, but there are other people that may or may not have been dispatched by him. The Lady of the Lake is sometimes called victim number 0, which would mean 13. There was a victim in 1950 whose remains were found at a construction site at about East 22nd and Lakeshore, if I remember rightly. And the details of that murder were so striking and so similar to Kingsbury Run that Sam Gerber thought it might be the same person. Now, there were other butcheries that took place in Youngstown and in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania murders took place in an area outside of Newcastle. I taught at a college near Newcastle for 7 years, and I can assure you Newcastle, Pennsylvania is one of the 2 armpits of the nation. I'm not sure what the other one is, but I'm pretty sure about this one. And there was a swamp that was adjacent to the city. It was virtually impenetrable. And they began finding decapitated, otherwise mutilated bodies there in the 1930s and into the 1940s. And the Cleveland police, at least some of the Cleveland police, were ready to believe that these were all being done by the same person, and the person who did it probably rode the rails, probably was a hobo. The problem with those Pennsylvania murders was, first of all, the implement of disarticulation seems to have been a saw. The Kingsbury Run butcher used a knife. The victims in Pennsylvania were rather sloppily cut. Whoever did it in Cleveland knew exactly what he was doing. He knew where to cut. He knew the landmark of a human body. Also, the Kingsbury Run murderer never tried to hide his victims. He just dumped them out in plain sight for God and everybody. The Pennsylvania victims were all hidden. It's only by a stroke of luck they were ever found. The best guess is that they were probably mob killings from Pennsylvania and from Youngstown. Well, something very interesting happened in the summer of 1936, and I freely admit, when I first wrote the first edition of Butcher, I did not fully appreciate how remarkable this was. The Cuyahoga County coroner, a man named Arthur Pierce, he was Sam Gerber's predecessor, called in the summer of 1936 what the newspapers dubbed a torso clinic. And what he did was call in all the police who had worked on the case. He called in Eliot Ness, who at that point was Cleveland's safety director. He brought in the anatomists from Western Reserve Medical School and the heads of the various mental institutions in the area. And they just had a skull session. What are we looking for? And it wasn't until after I wrote the first edition of the book that I realized this is one of the first examples of what today we would call modern FBI profiling. Very, very advanced. They decided it was somebody who, as I said, knew the geography of a human body. The doctors who were on this panel, if I can use that word, I think were somewhat socially conscious, and they were unwilling to admit that somebody so socially as prominent as a doctor could be doing this. And so they were more concerned that it might be a butcher or it might be a hunter, someone like that.
Okay. All right, so interesting, I came across an article that was published about 3 years ago in Cleveland Magazine. You know, I think it was right about the time you wrote the second edition of the book, where you just emphatically said, I know who it is.
Yeah, I did. I'm as sure as I think I can possibly be. This goes back to a story that Eliot Ness told his biographer, Oscar Fraley. Of course, theoretically, the crimes were unsolved. Ness told Fraley that somebody had come under suspicion, that his operatives were following this man, that they picked him up and took him to a room in the old Cleveland Hotel, which is now got, what is it called on Public Square? Renaissance, yeah. And apparently Ness had a room there that was set aside just for this purpose. And they took this guy there, and he was so drunk it took them 3 days to dry him out. Then he called in Leonard Keeler from Chicago. And Leonard Keeler is the man who invented and perfected the modern polygraph. Brought him to Cleveland in total secrecy, put him up someplace and had him give this guy a lie detector test. And after the test was over, Keeler turned to Ness and said, "That's your man. I might as well throw my machine out the window if I say anything different." The problem was no one could prove that that had actually happened.
That the whole hotel room?
The whole story. Some people said this is only Eliot Ness in his old age who can't bring himself to admit there was a crime he couldn't solve. And so when I began working on the first edition of Butcher, the question was, did it really take place? Can that man be identified? And then, of course, did he do it? And I was able to discover, yes, it did take place. And I was able to discover what his name was. His name was Surgeon Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney. And is he related to the law-abiding Sweeneys in Cleveland? Very, very distantly. But his first cousin was Martin L. Sweeney, who was the congressman from the 20th District. Now, in the first edition as a Butcher, all I could say is, yes, the interrogation took place, and it was Francis Edward Sweeney. For the second edition of Butcher, I was able to say with a fair degree of certainty, yeah, this is the guy that did it. For one thing, I learned that he shared an office with 5 other physicians on Broadway and Pershing. It had been a residence, and the doctor who owned the house was named Dr. Paterka, and he worked at St. Alexis Hospital, as did Francis Sweeney and the other 4 doctors. His parents had built the house, and sometime in the early 1930s, they moved out. He moved in. He converted the bottom floor to medical offices, even minor surgery, but the upstairs he kept as a living quarters if anybody wanted to stay there. This was right next door to the Rouse Funeral Home. And Rouse had a contract with the city for taking care of the indigent and the unclaimed dead. I also learned that Rouse had another facility around on Meade Avenue, which was virtually in spitting distance of the Broadway site. The building, by the way, no longer exists, but it was purely for the indigent and the unclaimed. One of Eliot Ness's associates in the 1980s, in an interview which no one knew about until quite recently, said that Sweeney enjoyed some sort of privilege with Rouse, that he could go over to the house, and probably the one on Meade Avenue, and practice surgical techniques. And one of the big questions has always been, well, where did the blood go? Well, an undertaking parlor is perfectly equipped to get rid of the blood. And the Meade facility was a couple of blocks away from where the first two official bodies were found and where the fourth body was found, and the sixth for that matter. An interesting sidelight to this is victim number 11, who was a woman. And she was discovered by 3 black scrap collectors at the corner of East 9th and Lakeshore. There was a dump site there, and they were looking for scrap metal to sell. And they found this woman's torso wrapped in an old quilt, wrapped again in a man's double-breasted blue blazer, and the arms and legs wrapped in brown butcher paper, maybe as a joke, and held together with rubber bands. The coroner, by the way, Gerber did not perform the autopsy. A city pathologist did. And I've got the autopsy report, or at least a copy of it. And it says, probable murder victim, cause of death unknown. The body parts were then turned over to the anatomy department of Western Reserve University Medical School. And the head anatomist, a man by the name of T. Wingate Todd, called one of Ness's associates, a man by the name of David Cowles, who was head of what today we would say was Cleveland CSI, and said, get your posterior over here. And when Cowles got over there, Todd showed him the body parts and said, this is not a legitimate torso victim. This woman was already dead. The body had been embalmed. My reasoning is that the interview with Sweeney in the hotel room took place in May of 1938. That's about as close as we can pinpoint it. These bodies were discovered in August of 38. I think what Sweeney wanted to do was to get his back at Ness, but knew he was being followed and being kept, and people were keeping an eye on him, so he went to the Rouse Funeral Home and cut up an already embalmed body and dumped it. And Cleveland bought it. To this day, she's known as victim number 11. Francis Sweeney went to Western Reserve and got a degree in pharmacology in 1923. He then took a couple of science classes at John Carroll, apparently to plug up some gaps in his scientific knowledge. And then he went to med school at the University of St. Louis. Came back to Cleveland in 1929 and became an intern at St. Alexis. He married a nurse at St. Alexis in the summer of 1927. In December of 1933, she took him to court to have his sanity questioned. And she said that he was letting his practice go, that he was becoming physically and mentally abusive to her and the children, that he would disappear for long periods of time without saying where he was going, that he'd become a raging alcoholic. And so he was committed to Cleveland Hospital for a month while they dried him out, which is, of course, where Edward Andrassy worked as an orderly. He was released a month later. Within a week after that, she was back in court swearing out, I don't think it would be called a warrant, but some sort of, pick him off the streets, he's dangerous. And after that, he pretty much falls off the radar. We're not exactly sure where he was. We do know he was in and out of the Sandusky Soldiers and Sailors Home. He had been a medic in World War I. Somebody who researched this about the same time I did traced him to the Sandusky home. And the woman told her that there was a note in his file that said, if he disappears from the facility, the Cleveland police are to be alerted. Now, when I got out there several years later, that note was long gone. But I was able to get what was left of his file, and he was in and out of the facility several times. He was clearly mentally ill in the early 30s when his wife took him to court. And she said his problems began probably around 1929, 2 years after they married. There are some postcards in the files of the Western Reserve Historical Society, which he sent to Eliot Ness, never admitting anything, but I'll get to that in a moment. Crazy things, sort of, you know. One of them was addressed to Eliot, parentheses, headman, parentheses, Ness. I took those 5 cards, which made absolutely no sense to me, to my uncle, who was a practicing psychiatrist. And although he was very reluctant to make a judgment about somebody you can put on the couch, he looked at them and said, I would say paranoid schizophrenia, probably manic depression to boot. And I said, but this guy went to medical school, became a doctor, and had a couple of good years of practice. I thought schizophrenia manifested itself when you were a teenager. And he said, well, usually yes, but later manifestations are not unknown. And the way he explained it, said he probably began to experience the onset of schizophrenia the way you and I would experience the onset of a cold or the flu, and that his way of dealing with it was to drink. And I've since learned that alcoholism was and still is a major problem in the family. And then he began writing fake prescriptions for himself. He ultimately wound up in the Veterans Facility in Dayton, Ohio. He was declared completely incompetent by the VA in 1956. There is a letter in his file at the Ohio State Medical Licensing Bureau saying, will you please take this man's medical license away, because he writes prescriptions and then takes the drugs himself and becomes a management problem. Well, the inertia in official agencies, they took his medical license away 1 week before he died. He had 2 children. One became a Marine and was killed in an auto accident in 1947 at a railroad crossing. I was only able to put some of this together fairly recently. His wife, or ex-wife at that point, she divorced him, obviously, moved out to California because all her nursing records for St. Alexis were sent out there about 47, 48. The younger of the 2 sons stayed in Cleveland and lived with one of her brothers so that he could finish high school at Garfield Heights High. And I've got his picture from the 1948 yearbook. As far as I know, he probably then moved out to California to be with her. We've tried tracing him. He'd be 81 years old now if he was still living. She did not die until the mid-1990s. She was well into her 90s. I wish I had known that. He is buried in Calvary Cemetery in a 4-grave plot. You know, one of these with a very large headstone, 2 bodies 6 feet down, and then 2 bodies 12 feet down. He is buried with his sister and her husband and their son. His grave is not marked. There is no one in Cleveland now with the last name of Sweeney who is directly related to him. No one. There are some people who are descended from his sisters, but they obviously have other names. Time for a story. Old people always have stories. I got an email a couple of years ago from a woman saying, my husband and I were watching a rerun of Criminal Minds last night, and it took place in Cleveland, and they talked about the Torso murders. I didn't know about them, so I looked them up, and I was horrified to find how terrible they were, and also horrified to find that the main suspect is my great uncle.